Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Stack Up series. Today we'll be talking about Red Bull, and where they stacked up against Mercedes and Ferrari, those constructors around them in the constructor standings, as well as the two Red Bull drivers, Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, and where they stacked up against the drivers in the Drivers' Championships, where they ended up. So I'll be comparing those drivers against the other drivers around them, against the finishing positions that they had for each race and the trend lines that they come out due to those finishing positions. So we'll start off with some general stats for the team and the two drivers. So we know Red Bull finished third in the constructor standings. Their average starting position was 6th and their average finishing position was 5th. And they had 6 DNFs between the two drivers. Now, it's kind of shocking and kind of interesting to see because you think of Red Bull, they're finishing out, in the top of their league for the Drivers' Championship, and they were really competitive in the constructor standings. So you were thinking that they would be higher in the starting positions and really the finishing positions as well. But you get that 6th and that 5th, which are still getting great points throughout the season, but just not quite where you thought they would be in general if you're looking at those statistics. And if we break that down to the two drivers, we see Sergio Perez, who finished 8th in the drivers' standings. His starting position was in 9th, and his average finishing position was in 7th. And he had a total of 5 of those DNFs, of the 6 DNFs for the Red Bull team. Now, that's far back. I mean, that's almost at their point markers for his starting positions, for his average. Now, he did get some points because he did get up higher in those finishing positions into that average of 7th position. So doing decent there, but not quite where they want him to be on par with Max Verstappen. And really kind of bringing down the team in general if you just look over the general stats. Now, you have to take some other things into consideration in his running and his very, very well consistencies. And how that he plays out in that Red Bull and how that Red Bull, fits him in his driving style. And you look at his teammate, Max Verstappen, who finished first. His average was 4th starting position, and his average finishing position was 3rd. And he had 1 of those DNFs. And again, you think Max Verstappen, the Drivers' Championship, you think his starting position would be a little higher up on that average, and his finishing position would maybe be that 2nd position on average instead of that 3rd. But if you really dive into it, you can kind of get the idea. His season played out in this Red Bull season for 2024 and where he ended up, and was still able to manage getting that 1st position for that driver's standings. So here we're comparing the two Red Bull drivers in these 6 sprint races, and you can kind of compare those against each other and how well they did, and their trend lines are both going up, so they were both getting worse throughout the season. Yet you can see that Sergio Perez was getting worse at a faster pace if you look at that trend line compared to Max Verstappen. Now, so you can try to figure out, okay, if both those Red Bull drivers are getting worse throughout the season, is that really due to the drivers, or is that due to the car and the development of the car comparative to those other cars around them? And so they weren't quite as competitive and weren't able to gain that advantage throughout the season. So they were kind of playing off as that season went on. So I think that's generally what it is that the other teams were developing their cars and getting that little edge over Red Bull, where Red Bull didn't fit that mold this season, or to be able to keep up in the development of that 2024 Red Bull chassis. But if you compare the two drivers themselves, you can see that Sergio Perez is always behind Max Verstappen in all of the sprint races in his finishing positions. Even though he started off fairly close at the beginning of the season, he kind of got farther and farther off as the season went on. So it seems like either the car wasn't developed in Sergio Perez's liking, or he was kind of dropping off due to the pressure and due to the situation that he was in, not really feeling how to get the most out of that Red Bull. He had a little bit of wide, swings here and there, dropping off a little, or actually getting a lot better in Brazil, but then falling off quite a bit in Qatar. So you have to kind of keep that in mind in that running. Whereas Max Verstappen was very steady, for those first 3 sprint races, and then it hit the Brazil and the Qatar, was kind of dropping off in that Red Bull a little bit more than he was probably hoping to. But of course, this is the sprint races, and so it didn't give you a whole lot of point differences for the season in that Drivers' Championship. And we've got to dive into a little bit more detail here, comparing Sergio Perez against the two drivers around him, which was Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, on those same 6 sprint races. And so you can kind of see that they all kind of start off really close together in China, but then they kind of separated a little bit throughout the rest of the season. Whereas Sergio Perez was kind of on a steady line, getting slightly worse, but kind of being more consistent than Fernando Alonso, who had that really good run at the very beginning, and then tailed off for those next 4 races, and then started getting better at the end. And Lewis Hamilton having a bad off in Miami, but being more consistent throughout the last 4 sprint races, kind of putting him on level with Sergio Perez on those as an even number for those sprint races. Now, Sergio Perez was going up on that trend line, which is bad because that means his average finish position was getting worse throughout the season. And that kind of goes with Fernando Alonso, even though it wasn't quite as steep a trend line going bad. It was just slowly going up, so it wasn't quite as bad looking for Fernando Alonso. And then, of course, Lewis Hamilton is fairly even across the season. So he was kind of being able to take as much advantage as he could out of that Mercedes to keep that finishing position roughly where he started off the season with. And yeah, it doesn't look that way in the first start, but over on the average is kind of what I'm looking at here. And so he's overtaking Perez by the end of the season for Lewis Hamilton, get in front of Fernando Alonso by the end of the season for Sergio Perez. So in that regard, you can kind of look at that and kind of judge for yourself how those races played out. And here we see Max Verstappen getting compared to his only person around him as he finished in that first position. So he's comparing himself against Lando Norris, who finished in that second position for that Drivers' Championship. So you only get 2 drivers here to compare, and you can kind of look at those where Lando was getting much better throughout the season, and Max Verstappen was getting worse at the end of that sprint season. He was, as I said, he was really consistent at the very beginning, and then he had those 2 bad sprint races at the end of the season, which really hurt his trend line. Whereas the opposite was kind of looked like it was Lando having a really bad beginning of the season and kind of coming back decent in that midsection, but getting a fairly decent run at the end of the season in those 2 last sprint races to help his trend line go down, which is a better finishing position. So that looks what we're looking for, is that downward movement in those trend lines. Now we get to a little bit more meat of the data here. We're comparing the 2 Red Bull drivers in those GP races. So we get those are all across the bottom of this graph. And of course, their finish positions are on that y-axis. And so you have the gaps there showing the DNFs that they had for those runs. So you have a little bit of gap in those sequences, but you can kind of see how they played out against each other, where Max Verstappen was very consistent for the most part, getting slightly worse, as I said, going throughout the season, which probably plays more into that Red Bull development compared to the other constructors around them instead of the driver's ability. Whereas that didn't affect quite as much on Max Verstappen's point of view as it did on Sergio Perez, where he started off behind Max Verstappen, but still fairly consistent, fairly close to Max Verstappen at the very beginning of the season, but that gap widens out as that season progresses. And you can see a couple of those bad races that Sergio Perez had that kind of threw him off on some of those trend lines as well, whereas Max Verstappen didn't have quite as many of those really bad offs on those races. He was doing, his normal, doing bad for him, but not necessarily, those big spikes in his ending positions. And you can kind of get that gauge and kind of look at those 2 drivers, and you can really see that Max Verstappen is really good at getting the most out of that Red Bull and being very consistent with that, getting where he can. Whereas any little thing that changes on that Red Bull probably affects Sergio Perez a little bit more, and that shows throughout this graph as that season progresses. And of course, the pressure gets mounted on Sergio Perez with all of the questions about being let go from the team. And I know they tried to relinquish that partway through the season by giving him that extension that didn't turn out to be what the paper was worth in general, because he was let go at the end of the season anyway. But as that was progressing, you trying to figure out how that would play out against him, and how that Red Bull played out against the rest of the field. So we come back to Sergio Perez comparing himself against the Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, so the two drivers that finished around him on the Drivers' Championship. And you can compare those numbers against the GP races and how he plays out. Like, he was very good at the very beginning of the season, and then he slowly got worse throughout the season as it went through. Now, Fernando Alonso kind of played along those same lines, doing not as good as either of the two drivers at the very beginning, but was able to pick that up fairly quickly. But then he had that mid-third section, had those really bad races that really hurt him in that trend lines aspect of it, but was able to gain ground on that middle section again, then having a little bit of bad luck at the end as well, but fairly consistent, slowly getting worse throughout the season, but not near as abruptly as Sergio Perez was throughout the season. So you can tell that Fernando Alonso was able to try to tweak and try to get as much as he could out of the situations that he was in that Aston Martin, compared to Sergio Perez, who that Red Bull was just getting a lot worse for him to handle throughout this season. And then you have Lewis Hamilton, who started off between the two and was fairly consistent and was slightly getting better throughout the season. I know he was putting a lot of frustration in that Mercedes, but you can tell here that he was actually doing fairly well in that Mercedes compared to the other two drivers that are around him in that Drivers' Championship. I know that he wanted to be at the front of that pack, fighting for that, first position in that driver's standing and getting another Drivers' Championship, where he was fairly far off on that regard, even though he did put a little bit of pressure around those drivers. But you can see that he was getting better throughout the season, getting that feeling for that Mercedes, and again, that Mercedes had developed slightly more towards his liking, giving him that ability to handle that car. And then that midsection was doing fairly well in those races, which kind of, you assume, probably fits the Mercedes style rather than the rest of the season in that ability, as he had that big jump in that section of races where it tailed off again at the end of the season. And again, we're comparing the top two drivers for this 2024 season with Max Verstappen and Lando Norris, and kind of how that season played out against each other throughout this season. As you can see, Max Verstappen started off really strong, being very consistent in the first position, and then having a little bit wider swings as the season went on, kind of getting him caught up in some of the other mix and other trouble that he was running into in that Red Bull. Not quite to his liking, where that Red Bull was not quite keeping up the development, I think, in my personal opinion, with the other constructors around them, which kind of hurt him, but he was still able to try to get the most out of that Red Bull that he could, keeping him in that first driver's position, and giving him that another driver's championship that he earned. And you can see that Lando Norris started off the season fairly poorly, but was then able to kind of get his rhythm going in that midsection, and had a couple of offs at the end, but was able to start coming back at that very last race in Abu Dhabi to really cement where his standing was for this season. Whereas Max Verstappen, as I said, started off strong, had a little bit more ebbs and flows in his running throughout the season, getting worse throughout the season compared to Lando Norris, which is fairly steady if you look at the overall averages of his finishing position. So you can see that Red Bull was not quite up to par throughout the season. They probably needed to put a little bit more development, try to figure out how to get the most and have that next step in that Red Bull's competitiveness against the other constructors around them, which helped Max out, keeping that driver's championship. And here we're comparing the teams and the amount of points they scored per race, and where those trend lines were on those teams themselves. So we're comparing Red Bull, and that's in that blue, against the Mercedes, which is in an aqua, and the Ferrari, which is in red. And you can see here that the Red Bull started off the season really strong, getting lots of points at that very beginning of the season, and that kind of tailed off in that middle section. We're kind of coming back a little bit in the end, but quite not enough to really put the extra pressure on Ferrari. Whereas you see Mercedes starting off the season fairly poorly, had a decent run in that middle section, kind of ebbed down a little bit right before that last third, and then kind of coming back up. So they were having a little bit of ebbs and flows themselves as a team, but were able to get a decent amount of points and put a little bit more pressure on Red Bull to gain that position, and maybe even put a little pressure on Ferrari in that running as well. And you can see those trend lines. Now this is the points that are getting collected. So the points going up, so the trend lines going up are better than the ones going down. The ones going down are bad. And so you see Red Bull is trend line going down throughout the season. So they were getting less points the farther the season went on compared to the two other teams around them. So Ferrari fairly consistent, but gaining a little bit of ground, and Mercedes starting off bad, but getting stronger as the season went through. And you can kind of compare where those kind of crossed and where they think they're going to cross in relationship, and so you can kind of get a estimate of how well they're doing and where they would have ended up if you kept going on this season. And here we're looking at that same data, but we're just looking at a step graph format, so you can kind of get a better comparison on where those teams ended up and were crossing each other, getting close to each other during the rest of the full season aspect. So you can see that, Mercedes started off behind everybody and ended up everybody having that little bit of lag at the very beginning, which hurt them really be competitive in the full season as they were starting to gain ground and be along the lines of Red Bull and Ferrari, but were still behind them at that point. Whereas Ferrari was really putting pressure on Red Bull at the very beginning, even though they were behind Red Bull at the very beginning of the season. And then they were putting that pressure throughout, where at the end they were able to overtake the Red Bull and ended up into that second position and push Red Bull back down to that third constructor's position. And you can kind of see where that happened, around that Circuit of the Americas marker. Now we'll have to look forward to this 2025 season and see if they put too much effort on the 2024 season, or were they able to, switch over early enough to be competitive in the 2025 season at the beginning of the season as well, or if they're going to have to put a little bit more catch up in that regard compared to Red Bull, who probably put a little bit more effort in that 2025 season over the ending of the 2024. So next up is Ferrari and where they stacked up against those around them. So that'll be coming up next week, and we have the 3 drivers, but I'm only going to concentrate on the 2 main drivers for Ferrari. And if you wanted to see Oliver Bearman and where he stood on this running, go look at my Haas stack up earlier on, and you'll get a little bit of idea. I put him over there because he ran a little bit more races on the Haas versus the Ferrari for this last season. Until then, farewell, and I will see you on the grid.